Institute. And I hope that you see this today, there's a theme, and tomorrow with all the keynotes, that we really want to take our best and brightest and put them where they're needed most. And I love the vibe and the attitude. And without further ado, I'll let you hear from the man himself. We're really honored to have Jim Routh come, and he's going to get on a plane immediately thereafter, but we're really pleased he's going to set the right tone for putting our best and brightest where needed most. Thank you.
Josh, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Thank you. So I was having a conversation with a VP of development, and it went something like this. I was saying, look, this mobile app that you want to release next week, you haven't done a threat model, you haven't done static analysis, you haven't done dynamic scanning, and the authentication is all screwy and you're passing creds in the clear. So absolutely under no circumstances is this going to be released. You just can't do it. Well, one thing led to another, and it got kind of heated, and there was a bit of a scuffle, and this was the result. Right? So that's story number one. Story number two, for you two gentlemen here, the younger guys in the crowd. So story number two is it was a little warm on Memorial Day, and in my house it got up to about 85 degrees, and I have this attic fan. So I turned on the attic fan, but in order to get it optimal airflow, I had to pull down the door to the attic, which came out from the ceiling, and pulled it down about 2 feet, down. And then I went downstairs and forgot all about it. And I was coming upstairs later on, maybe an hour later, and I was carrying a pair of shoes because I was packing to come to Boston. And I walked right into the door. Bam! That's what happened. So story number one or story number two? Which one is true? Two? Two? What do you think? This is a table. You got to decide here. What do you think? Two? You're going with two? Yeah, you're absolutely right. Story number one was totally prefab. Story number two was showing what a bumbling idiot I am. And in fact, story number two is true. So I'm going to try to ask you a few questions a little later on where the degree of difficulty in answering them will get a little bit higher than that. All right. So, but that was just kind of the warm up. So what I'm going to suggest to you is something that's a little bit controversial, and I do that by intent. So my intent is to make it a little controversial. So if you want to ask a question or a comment, feel free to interrupt me. I could care less if we cover all this material. So I'm happy to talk about anything that you like to talk about. But I'm suggesting to you that in order to deal with the evolving threat landscape today, you've actually got to take some risks. And in fact, you got to take a little bit more risk than maybe you're comfortable with. And so that's my proposition. And that may sound a little strange, being a risk practitioner. I'm actually encouraging you to take more risk. But what I'm going to share with you is exactly what I do today, which is to take more risk in order to manage risk, and I'll show you how we do that. So the typical CISO role, according to the source here, Wikipedia, basically uses one primary verb, which is our job is to reduce information technology risk. This is a definition for Wikipedia. Now, what I'm going to suggest to you is that applies to about 90% of all the people that are in a position of Chief Security Officer, Chief Information Security Officer. What I'm also going to suggest to you is I'm in the 10% category, so I don't fundamentally believe in that verb. I actually believe that we need to, in order to manage risk more effectively, we actually have to take some risk. I'm going to show you how I take some risks. So I'm in that 10% category. I'm actually encouraging all of you that are risk practitioners in information security that you actually slide more to the right versus to the left. So that's the hypothesis. So there's a lot of breaches that we can talk about now because they're in the public domain. They're on primetime TV. As a matter of fact, one of the things I'm going to suggest that you may want to consider as an information security practitioner, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when I started in information security, I spent a lot of time and effort on security awareness. Spent a lot of time, resources on security awareness. Today, what I've done is I've outsourced security awareness to CBS. And CBS has done a very good job of that. So you've got choices of 4 different episodes of 60 Minutes, and you get through product placement in 60 Minutes while you do that too, so that's nice. And if you want a little bit more entertainment value, you got CSI Cyber, which is Wednesday nights, 10 o'clock on the East Coast, So now, I mean, I'm just outsourcing security awareness to 60 Minutes and cybersecurity, or CSI Cyber, and I think it makes a lot of sense. So anyway, there's an example of taking a little bit more risk. So anyway, we've got a lot of breaches, and what's happening is that nation states are getting a lot more actively involved in attacking the private sector in terms of private enterprise. So if you're in whether you're healthcare or financial services or really any industry, you're potentially subject to nation state attacks. And that means that their nation states are good. They're really talented, and they have a lot of resources. So you kind of have to up your game by default simply because of what's shifted. And if we look at, if I told you 5 months ago that a nation state would try to prevent you from going to the movie theater to see a lousy movie, what would you say? Absolutely no way, right? But in fact, that's exactly what happened, right? So the fundamental shift in our threat landscape is causing us to have to react and respond a lot more quickly than what we have in the past. In this case, CSI Cyber is actually a good metaphor here. Get the yellow crime scene tape out, because attribution in most of these breaches is really hard. In this case, we're told by federal government, President Obama, FBI, others, that the nation state that initiated this attack was North Korea. And in fact, from the evidence that's available, that's true. North Korea did initiate the attack, especially the destruction of data. But they weren't the only one. They weren't the only threat actor in there. There was 2 other threat actors that were involved. This is Jim's hypothesis based on the information that's publicly available, and some of the stuff that's not publicly available. And essentially, there are 2 other that did the exfiltration and the penetration of the HR system. Those actually 2 other threat actors. So there's actually 3 threat actors. And for Sony, there were 9 different breaches over a period of, since 2011 to now, 9 different security breaches that took place. So it's kind of hard. It's like a crime scene where people walk across the crime scene and infect the evidence. Essentially, it's really hard to figure out attribution in many of these cases. That's true with Anthem as well. It's certainly a nation-state-sponsored threat actor here. But they had 6 breaches over a 3-year period of time. And the initial phishing infrastructure was actually put up in December of 2013, so it wasn't necessarily a month before they announced that breach. And so again, difficult in terms of attribution, but somewhat of a pattern here in terms of a pattern of breaches and a number of different breaches that occur, and that's certainly true with Premera and Care First, as happened in healthcare. And so what I'm suggesting to you is that this notion of waiting for regulation to drive advanced practice in information security is fundamentally obsolete, and it's not tenable. And there's a number of reasons for that. Here's one reason, is that when you have an event, major breach, what happens? Well, there's awareness of the need to improve practices, and that actually manifests itself in terms of the legislative process, either through executive order, which we saw recently, or it goes to a committee, and the committee decides when that bill has some legs that will ultimately be brought through the legislative agenda. And that's process very much like making sausage. You really don't want to see what goes into it. You're not too bad about the end product. And then ultimately that results in law. And that has little to do with the practitioners at the enterprise level, because until the regulatory agencies figure out how to apply the rules and enforce the law, it doesn't really have teeth or have impact in terms of the private enterprise. So if we look at this cycle, and by the way, I'm very proud of the fact that we have a democratic government in the United States, but let's face it, has anybody ever called that efficient? No, I don't think so. This doesn't happen efficiently. In the case of HIPAA in healthcare, this took 17 years, right? So GLBA took about 6-7 years. So this is a long cycle, even when there's urgency around specific events. And so we shouldn't look for answers to the cybersecurity challenge that we face today based on regulatory mandate. And in fact, what you'll see, and what we have seen, is the knee-jerk reaction is to do something like this. Oh, let me translate that to you. That means encrypt data at rest, right? So what essentially legislators are saying is encrypt all the data and that solves all the problem. There's reason why they're saying that. The primary reason is encryption is a pretty sexy word. You know, it's one word. It's a little bit off. We don't use it in everyday, common vocabulary. And it seems like it's very explicit. In other words, you say, whoa, encryption, that'll solve that problem. And everybody says, yeah, that makes sense, I guess, right? I mean, it just sounds like it flows. So the legislators are going to constantly throw this around because they're not practitioners. They don't really understand the implications of this. And frankly, what's happening today is threat actors are stealing credentials. And they're using those credentials to penetrate an organization. And they're getting privileged user credentials, and that's what they're after. So let me ask you, if you encrypt all your data, somebody has to hold the keys, right? So if your privileged users are the ones that are getting attacked and they hold the keys, this doesn't really solve the problem, right? So aside from that, at a large enterprise, it's really hard to do this, very expensive and really difficult to do. So the degree of difficulty goes up. So that's not necessarily a good answer. The other answer that you typically hear again in legislative circles is, it's a framework problem. If everyone would just adopt a framework, this problem would go away, right? So take your pick of frameworks. There's plenty of frameworks out. Well, I'll just tell you from my perspective as a practitioner, I choose frameworks based on business drivers. So I've chosen NIST cybersecurity framework and 853. Why? 38% of my business is with the federal government. So I'm not going to choose a different framework. I'm going to choose a framework that works for my constituents, but that's a fundamental business decision. If I was in a pharmaceutical industry and most of my R&D was done in Europe, you think I'd pick NIST? No, of course not. I'd pick ISO 27001. So I'm going to choose this from a business perspective. So there is no one answer from a framework, and the reality is frameworks are good. Frameworks, everybody should adopt a framework. Does that solve the problem here in terms of the cybersecurity risk associated with the threat landscape? Absolutely no. Don't mix those two things up. Absolutely not. So what have we learned? Well, I'll tell you what nation states have learned. Nation states have learned where the rich data is about us. And they've decided that they're going to harvest that the same way the private sector is harvesting that today. So a question to all of you. And this is where the questions get a little bit more challenging. So who is Google's customer? You're familiar with Google services, right? You know, they have search capability, Gmail, somebody may be using Google Docs. You know, they've got lots of different products and services that they offer to you, the consumer, right? So the question I'm asking is, who is Google's customer? This is the part in the presentation where you answer. Sorry? Advertisers, absolutely right. It's not you, right? So you're consuming all of the services. The services are designed to make it easy for you to transact, to do things in the virtual world, right? But you're not the customer, and make no mistake about it, because you're something far more important. What do you think that is? Yeah, you're the product. We're the product, right? Google spends a ton of money, in this case, 24 petabytes of data that they collect each day, right? Do they ever ask you to pay for that? No. You are not the customer, you're the product. And nation states have fundamentally learned this as well. I'll give you one other example that's kind of interesting. It's the intersection of cloud and mobile. So this device here, let's recognize this device for what it is. This device is the most effective spying machine ever invented in the course of human history. That's what this device is. And the beauty of it is it's all legal. So let me explain. So 90% of 18 to 29-year-olds sleep with their device within 5 feet of their head, okay? If you go in a higher age group, it only drops down to 65%. So most of us, the cell phone is an appendage. It's part of who we are. We lose our wallet, it stays lost for days. We lose our cell phone, we know about it in hours, right? So it's part of our being, and it collects a ton of data. We have this notion, 65% of parents think they're a better parent just because they have a smartphone, right? Go figure. This is interesting. 75% of people say that they bring their phone to the bathroom. I'll let you draw your own conclusions from that. So how many people use Apple iPhone? How many people use that? Yeah. You ever use Siri? Right? It's kind of cool, right? When you use Siri, do you know that everything you say to Siri is captured and attributed to you for 6 months, right? And it's aggregated activated and stored for 18 months. Now, I don't know whether that's good or bad. I'm just telling you that is, and I'm not sure you are aware of that. But, you know, Siri gets propositioned for marriage about 30% of the time. I don't know if you're aware of that. Yeah. So, I mean, you know, not that that's kind of a useless fact. But here's one other example. Facebook and Google, they've kind of figured this out big time. So, do you know that Facebook and Google have the ability to begin recording audio on your phone anytime they want? Okay? Anytime they want. And what they're doing with that audio is they're actually analyzing the ambient sound in the background, and they're trying to determine what they can deduce from that information to be able to commercialize that information to advertisers. All right? And Facebook, in this case, has 54 million cell phone users, right, or smartphone users that have downloaded it. So what's the most common app on a mobile device? The answer's up here. These answers are getting, you know, questions are getting easier in this way. Yeah, it's Facebook, right? Facebook in North America, social network around the world. It's the most common app. So you've got social networks and mobile device. Mobile device captures a ton of information about your behavior, and social networks capture a ton of information about your behavior. You put the two together, and it's a very powerful combination. So essentially, who authorized this invasion of privacy that I've just suggested here?
We did. We know that.
You got it. That's exactly right. You did. And here's how. It's something called terms of service, and we come across this all the time. As Americans, we average almost 1,500 times that we actually have to face term of service when we choose a cloud service or software that we're using in a SaaS model. And the average length is about 2,500 words. And topping it out, PayPal, if you looked at their terms of service, it would be a whopping 36,275 words, which is larger than Shakespeare's Hamlet. So those of you that struggle with that in high school, you know, try PayPal's terms of service on for size. Here's the LinkedIn. I don't know if you're aware. How many people use LinkedIn? How many people want to admit it now that I've just brought this slide up? Right. Well, I use LinkedIn, but here's something to recognize by LinkedIn. And this is really interesting. There are more verbs in this little compact paragraph that I never knew would apply to information, but essentially LinkedIn has the ability to improve, distribute, publish, remove, retain, add, process, analyze, use, commercialize in any way now known, in the future or in the future discovered, any information you provide directly or indirectly to LinkedIn, right? I mean, I don't know the lawyer that wrote that, but I'd like to hire that lawyer, right? I mean, can anybody think of an example that doesn't cover? I mean, you know, maybe firstborn son or something, but Jesus, I mean, that's pretty pervasive, right? So here's one more, Google Docs, and this is kind of fascinating. Those of us that want to share information and make that sharing much more convenient for others and might want to choose Google Docs. Let's say I had this presentation that I'm giving you and I put it on a Google Docs document that you could all have access to. Who owns that? Who owns the right to the content? Yeah, exactly. Not me, right? As soon as you choose that platform, Google owns the right to that content. So they'd manipulate this and they'd make sure they take this paragraph out. You know, they wouldn't want you to see that paragraph, so they'd manipulate in other ways. But the point is, they own it. And that's what we have to deal with. And the interesting thing about this is that not only have nation states kind of figured this out, you know how nation states, and this is true of all threat actors, the legal system we have internationally has pockets of enclaves that allow pretty much immunity from prosecution for cybercrime. We're all well aware of that, and that's kind of the challenge that we face. What you may not have been aware of is that the legal posture in the US is actually quite favorable to private enterprise capturing your information, and therefore nation states are starting to realize that that's value to them as well. And so an example is social networks. You can expect the same privacy in a social network as you can walking in the park. What that means is it's a public domain. So social networks are public domain legally, which means that any content that you introduce in that public domain, you should have no let me repeat that, no expectation of privacy, right? So just think about the content that you're putting into Facebook. If that's your social network of choice, you have no rights to that at all. As a matter of fact, Facebook has more rights than you do, according to the legal system. And divorce attorneys have kind of figured this out. 81% of divorce attorneys say they're searching social media just to gather evidence. 70% of HR professionals have rejected a candidate based on information that they have. And 86% of police departments are now routinely searching social media for investigations underway for criminal behavior. So we actually have created a legal framework to harvest any information that you provide either in a mobile device or using a social network. And so the threat actor, in this case sponsored by nation states, has figured out that the way to get to employers is through employees, and that's you. So that's why we're seeing so many public breaches of millions of credentials, specifically Social Security numbers, that are being stolen. Certainly true in healthcare, certainly true in financial services, and I would argue that it's crossing industry. So what's the most popular technique that's used to harvest people information or information about people? Social engineering, exactly, or phishing. Yeah, that's the number one technique that's in use today. And it's actually becoming easier to social engineer, not harder, according to the BBI information this year. So 23% of respondents are likely to open a phishing message. That number's going up, not down. As a matter of fact, if you're thinking about a phishing campaign, these are some stats that really make it quite economical. It's going to take about 1 minute and 22 seconds for you to get your first fish from a phishing campaign on average. And the chances of you getting caught doing this is pretty low as well. So essentially, it's attractive. So the question is, all right, what do we do about it? Well, according to SANS, in this case, Lance says that we should improve education, that will solve that problem. And what does Lance do, by the way? Oh, Director of SANS Securing the Human. Oh, so he sells training services. Oh, okay, well, I can see why that can be worthwhile. So this is my answer. Yes, improve education all you want. There's no way that you're going to solve this problem by education alone, okay? So that's not going to cut it. Maybe someday 10 years ago that made sense, not today. So the reality in cybersecurity today is there is no perimeter. The bad guys are using our credentials to get in, and there's implications to that. And for whatever reason, institutions and consumers still have an expectation that we're going to protect information, okay? So the implications are, don't spend money on perimeter controls because there is really no perimeter. And think in terms of inside-out technology. That's technology that allows you to determine what behavior is actually going on inside your environment going out. We find most of our malware at the endpoint today based on traffic that's going outbound. So that's this reality in cybersecurity. That's where you need to make your investment, not in terms of preventing people from getting in, because it's too easy to get in. The other component is behavioral-based authentication is replacing binary authentication. So what's binary authentication? Well, if I wanted to turn the lights off in this room, I'd go to a light switch and I'd eliminate the current. So I'd turn the switch off and eliminate the current. It's binary control. The lights are either on, power's running, or off, power's not running. On, off. It's one or the other. It's binary, right? 99% of our authentication controls today are binary, meaning user ID and password you're in. No user ID and password you're not. In or out, right? Do binary controls work when you have the credentials? Well, they do if you're legitimate, but if you're not legitimate, not so much, right? So binary controls, which are the primary controls in any enterprise today, are fundamentally obsolete if you have stolen the credentials, and that's what we face with today. So behavioral is key. So Pearl Bailey said she published a song in 1952, it takes two to tango, and it does. It takes a bad guy, in this case part of a criminal element, so we'll just assume it's one bad guy. And what the bad guy wants is our assets, electronic assets, and so there's lots of automation that the bad guy's going to throw to harvest information that will tell the bad guy where to focus on getting to those assets. And once they apply that, they have a route and vulnerabilities to exploit. Then there's some manual work that they're going to do, the sophisticated ones, to try to go east-west and essentially get credentials. And so that's what the bad guy's doing. On the good guy side, which is all of you, I'm assuming, is your enterprise. You're throwing a bunch of automation in the front end to try to prevent the opportunistic scanning that's happening on the other side. So you're throwing technology at the problem, just like the bad guy is, which makes sense. And then there's behavioral analysis of figuring out what the bad guy's doing once they get through those primary controls and are trying to go east-west with credentials. And essentially, you're analyzing what they're doing and trying to be proactive in creating friction, ultimately making it harder for them to accomplish what they want. That's essentially what's happening today. So what do you do to prevent this type of attack in your enterprise? This is what I do. Is it the right thing? I don't know. It's the thing that I think is going to reduce the probability of my wife being upset when I get fired. So that's why I'm doing it. It's really quite simple. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm protecting the consumer against phishing attacks. Well, how do I do that? Well, I use a standard called DMARC. What that means essentially is I'm authenticating my outbound email, and that authentication is publishing a record, a DMARC record, and I'm serving that record up to all the ISPs. And the ISPs have agreed to enforce policy that any email coming from an authenticated email server will be delivered to you, the consumer, and any email purporting to be, in this case, from Aetna that is not authenticated gets dropped. So what happens is the user experience is you see email coming from Aetna and it's legitimate. And that actually causes you over time to realize that you're going to respond more frequently to email that you trust. And the email that you don't trust, which includes the spam and malware, is not being delivered to you. So your confidence level goes up as a consumer. So basically, it's very easy technology to implement from a technical standpoint. A little bit harder, a little bit of herding cats to get your third-party procurement folks on board and to get the marketing people on board. But the reality is, when, as a security professional, this is what I call a trifecta, and it doesn't come around very often. And a trifecta, any horse racers here, you know what a trifecta is, right? It's where you have to pick who comes in first, second, and third in a horse race, and Kentucky Derby or whatever you're betting on. Now, what's the probability of you choosing who comes in first, second, and third? Is it high? I don't think so. It's really low, isn't it, right? Well, the probability of you having a trifecta in information security is relatively low as well, but this is one. This is actually an opportunity for you to do three things that don't normally come together. The first is reducing risk to the consumer. That's a good thing, right? The second is your operating costs go down, they don't go up. You actually reduce your operating costs because you're not dealing with account takeover from phishing attempts, which cost money to do that. Right? So your operating costs are dropped. You don't have to deal with the calls coming into the call center. So depending on what that cost is, like $40, $70 a call. So your operating costs are going down. The third, and this is the thing that's startling, your net profit is going up. Now, how does your net profit go up? Well, remember I told you that consumers gain more trust in the email? So what I've measured from implementing DMARC across the enterprise is the click-through rate is actually increasing. So I'm getting a 10% lift in click-through on all of the email that we're sending out to our consumers, which means that I have a higher transaction rate from whatever we're trying to sell or provide. And so that alone is driving higher revenue, which drives higher net profit. All right? So you got a threefer here. You reduce operating costs, you drive profit up, and at the same time you're reducing risk to the consumer. These kinds of programs don't come along very often. If I were you, I'd jump on it, because if you don't jump on it, here's what's happening. The people that are sending the spam and the phishing messages are no longer targeting campaigns for Aetna because of DMARC. Who are they targeting? That would be your organizations if you haven't implemented this, right? It's kind of like Jell-O. It's going to come out somewhere. So if you haven't done this, you better do this, because if you don't do this, you're going to be the only ones left, and then the spam and phishing is going to increase. So the second thing what I do is I look at the inbound problem of phishing, and I try to come up with some controls for inbound phishing protection. Now, I look at education, but from my standpoint, that's a conventional control, and it's not sufficient. It's not enough. And so what I'm suggesting to you is we need some unconventional controls that you have to design. That's what I'm doing. I'm investing in two things. I'm trying to use DMARC for inbound enforcement of messaging and see if there's a way of deriving value from that, number one, to isolate some of the bad phishing email that's coming through and make it harder for that to come through as a filter. Now that's what I call it's R&D. Like I think there'll be a product available next year for this, but right now I'm trying to design that product with a vendor to try to create that capability to satisfy me, and I'm not doing it for the good of the industry. I know Josh says we should do things for the good of the industry. I'm doing it to keep my wife happy. That's the only reason I'm doing it. I'm just telling you the honest truth. There may be a residual effect that may benefit other people, I'm not sure. The second thing I'm doing is I'm actually looking at infrastructure used for phishing, primarily that nation states use, and using an agent that looks just like a browser in that infrastructure to try to determine when the phishing campaigns are being launched at the front end. So the theory is that I have a higher probability of potentially blocking the phishing attempts by knowing the intelligence of when those phishing campaigns are targeting my organization. So that's the third thing that I'm doing. So I'm essentially trying to design new controls that don't exist today. And I fundamentally believe that this threat vector is the number one threat vector that we as enterprises have to deal with. And I'm not relying on conventional controls. I'm investing in emerging controls, and I welcome you to do the same. Because one of us in the room could come up with a model that we could adopt across the enterprise and help all of us, and that would be a good thing. I can tell you this, whatever I do come up with in terms of results, I will share with everybody here. That part of it is being a good cyber professional and a good citizen. So the third thing I would do is I'd recognize that binary authentication is not a model that's sustainable. So I'd invest in behavioral authentication, but recognizing that there's a convergence between authentication controls, behavioral analysis, and fraud management. And across any industry, those things are converging. And so you have to have a consistent data layer that you can use the IT people, the security people, and the fraud management people using the same data. In some industries like banking, they're converging the organization's units, but I'm just saying converge the data initially. So essentially, you've got all sorts of behavioral attributes that you can get based on the channel that your consumers are choosing to use. Harvest those behavioral attributes, many of which are benign, by the way. They're not even privacy issues, they're benign. You can harvest them and essentially build a rules engine that determines the risk of that user in that channel at that point in time. And that score, that risk engine score, can actually inform the application of how to handle requests based on that risk score. So essentially, if the risk score is high enough, the person's fully authenticated and has functionality for the entire application. If the risk score is low or below the threshold, then some step-up authentication, a higher level authentication, is initiated to require higher level of functionality. In the meantime, the application is interpreting that risk score to determine how much functionality to provide. And if the risk score is too low, then it goes back and becomes fraud, becomes a fraud pattern that gets investigated and interrupted in fraud. So essentially, this is the cycle. What I've described here is actually in place today. So there's an application that my company has, it's called iTriage. It's like the open table for healthcare. And it's actually, today, I interpret information about your behavior and create a risk score based on that behavior using things that are relatively benign. You've heard of the accelerometer. You guys know what accelerometer is? I'm seeing a few heads nod and some, yeah. So if I'm texting on my iPhone, and if I text vertically versus horizontally, the accelerometer is changing the orientation from portrait to landscape, right? It actually makes a lot more sense to text horizontally because you get the full keyboard up, but I don't know why. I text vertically, always. I don't text horizontally. It makes logical sense to do this, but I don't do that. Well, I can determine for any user the last 3 most commonly used applications and how the device was held for those applications. That actually creates a signature for you. As a matter of fact, if I wanted to take it to the nth degree, I can measure the accelerometer readings from how you walk with the phone in your pocket, right? So I can measure all of that and create a fingerprint for you, which is you as a user, not the device. I can also fingerprint the device, but now I can fingerprint the behavior of the user as well. Using information that's relatively benign. Now, there's lots of other information that's available to you from a technology standpoint, or the mobile app developer can choose to get your browser history. Would that be a good thing? Not in Josh's case. So, you know, we want to cross the line here of privacy, and we want to say, look, technology allows us to do certain things, but we're not going to do that. Like, for instance, I shouldn't be able to harvest your contact list, right? That's a no, but the technology allows you to do that today. Any mobile app on your device can harvest the contact list if the developer chooses to pull that information, right? So we want to determine what the right privacy line is, from not what technology will allow, but essentially create benign attribute information to create a risk model that essentially tells us this. Now, this is also being deployed today in another industry. How many people in the room have ever been called by their credit card company suspecting certain transactions to be fraudulent? All right, let the record show there's about 47% of the people in the room just raised their hand, right? Now, this is an example of the most profitable part of a transaction for a credit card company being interrupted by behavioral data that's essentially reducing the potential fraud and sacrificing, in this case, the revenue generation opportunity for another transaction. That's what's happening here. This cannot happen without behavioral analysis and without a lot of data that applies that. So I used to work for this little company, American Express, yeah, and I used to write algorithms for behavioral models that determine buying and spending patterns. And then that was merged with the risk function. And so I did risk models and behavioral models and kind of put together. And we did a pretty good job predicting your behavior. And we thought we could do a better job of that than you could. And so that's the world that is actually well established. This technology is very mature. It's not new or anything else. We just have to take it to other industries, because ultimately this is authentication of the future. So the evolving role of the CISO is one of taking risks in order to manage risk, in designing unconventional controls and not relying on conventional controls and just this notion of reducing risk. So I have a few minutes for any questions on anything I've shared today. And I have one from the RSA, or is that NSA? Is that NSA? Yeah?
There's not a real difference.
That's true. It's hard to determine. It looks very similar. Same red color. Yeah, go ahead. What do you got?
So, behavioral fraud detection doesn't work. I get called by my bank all the time. It's like, oh my God, you went to a neighborhood that's half a mile from where you live. Or in one case, I've locked out every credit card you have, both business and like corporate accounts and personal accounts, because you went on a business trip to 50 miles away. And you're out of cell phone service, so I hope you didn't need to buy anything. I mean, that's the current state of fraud detection for your mature technology. What makes you think it's going to work better for authentication?
Yeah, so everybody hear the question? So the question was more of a criticism that's basically saying this fraud detection doesn't work, right? Yes. Yeah. Can you name a bank today that does not use this technology?
They're required to use this technology.
So that would be no.
No, because they've had statutory and regulatory requirements.
There is no statutory and regulatory requirement that requires behavioral analysis. None. So they're not doing it because of regulatory needs. And they're all doing it. And the technology does work. Does it work 100% of the time? No. Does it work enough for them to interrupt the revenue generation process of creating a card transaction? Yeah. Is it one bank? No. It's every bank that's doing this. And it's every credit card company. And it should be other industries that are doing it. I'm doing it in healthcare. And if you log into iTriage today, I'm making an interpretation about your behavior to determine that it's you versus someone else, and it's totally invisible to you. And the technology is actually quite mature and works. So I'm sticking with it. You have a question back here?
So I had that about 8 months ago to Bank of America, and I stuck my ATM card in, got a phone call, and my chain walked away. 5 minutes later, the bank called me and said, "Do you have your ATM card with you?" So yeah, sure, I just used it. And somebody went in, they withdrew another 200 five to the car, they put it on they lifted them, and they went to the gas station and tried to swipe it. And that was just one example of when I've had the behavioral analysis work. Actually, surprisingly effective.
Yeah, pretty near time too, right? Real time. Huh? Was by any chance with the gas station in Florida? No. Oh, okay. The reason I say that is gas stations in Florida have 2 times the probability of fraud than gas stations anywhere else in the country. And for whatever reason, a lot of fraudsters in Florida, and they check the validity of your card to see whether it's still active by going to a self-service pump and trying it out. So, yep, question?
I'm sold on DMARC, but the problem is broad-scale adoption. How did you get your organization to even adopt it?
Yeah, so the DMARC sounds like a great standard, but why isn't everybody using it? And how did I get my organization to do it? Yeah.
And it also can cause you problems when you first adopt the law.
Yeah, so give me an example of some of the problems.
Well, if you're adopting DMARC, it could block potentially
Valid email? Yeah. Okay, so for large enterprise, I did this at a little bank in New York. What was the name of that bank? Oh, JP Morgan Chase, right. And I did it for Aetna, another small kind of organization, right? And the challenge of the implementation of DMARC is there are so many people, third parties largely, that send email on behalf of the enterprise that it's like the herding cat problem where you have to run around and let all of them know that if you don't authenticate properly using the DMARC standard, the email gets blocked once you enforce policy. And if the email gets blocked, it could be legitimate email that's being blocked, and that is absolutely the biggest challenge in implementation. The answer is actually intelligence, because you don't have to publish your DMARC record in enforcement initially. You can collect all of the third-party information that's being sent, any email that's being sent on your behalf. You can analyze and determine that and get each one of those vendors. So what I did, as an example, I've done this twice, and they've both been wildly successful. Both have taken 3 times the amount of time that I think is fundamentally necessary. But typically what I do is I start with third-party governance, and I put in enforcement. I put a policy in place that says any third party that's going to be in marketing or any kind of email generation has to establish a domain, a subdomain, the right way with the DMARC standard enforced. And so I do it at the front end, and then I wait over a period of time, and I analyze the data to see who's sending email that's not publishing a DMARC record on behalf of Aetna, and I go chase them down and find out. And one of the biggest, like Salesforce.com is one of the biggest senders of email for any kind of CRM, and you wouldn't necessarily think of that. I had to get, Salesforce.com took me 6 months to get them to adhere to the DMARC standard. And it's in their best interest to do that, but nonetheless, it's kind of the herding cat problem. So yes, there is a degree of difficulty in just getting organizational alignment. It requires security people to talk to marketing people. Is that a problem, anybody? You better believe it's a problem, right? But I'll tell you, this is honest God's truth. There are 2 parts of the organization at Aetna today that absolutely love me. And this doesn't happen in terms of a CISO. You don't experience this very often. One is the marketing people, because I'm driving revenue up, right? And the other is the salespeople, because they're basically trotting me out to talk to all the prospective plan sponsors that I'm supposed to tell them why what happened to Anthem is not going to happen to Aetna, right? So they all of a sudden, both of those cases. So CISOs can be loved in small pockets. Not usually, that's not the norm. But you got to work with marketing, and Josh made a point, you got to be able to communicate. Most of the security programs that I implement in both my former careers, I've been a CISO 3 other times, and here, I never say anything about risk. All I say is, it costs this today, and it will cost this tomorrow. Are you interested? And I'll take software security. One of the hardest things to fund a program for security is software security. I go to the CFO, I go to the CEO and the CIO, and I say, in the case of Aetna, we're spending $1.5 billion a year on maintaining, developing software. So I say to them, would you like a 15% return of productivity on the $1.5 billion that you're spending? And what CEO or CFO would say no, right? You can't say no to that. I say nothing about security. I basically say we're going to be more efficient in our development process, and I'm going to return 15% gain. And the gain is higher than that. I'm just saying 15% because it's a pretty easy bar to do. You implement a good software security controls into a development process, I'll guarantee you're going to reduce the defects by preventing defects, you can measure that, and by fixing defects earlier in the life cycle, you can measure that, and there's costs associated with that. It's pure dollars and cents. And every board and every CEO and every CIO knows how to speak that language. You don't have to say anything about risk. How are we doing now? Jim's flight is leaving. So I hope this was helpful. I hope I provoked some thinking in terms of taking some additional risks. I'm a firm believer in order to manage risk effectively that we have to take some risks, and hopefully I've shown you a couple ways of how to do that. May influence how you do things. It certainly keeps my wife happy. Thank you very much.